folks, we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. Please make your way to your seats. We've got a pretty strict timeline, small amount of time, and a lot of good information. So if you could please make your way to your seats, and if I could have my presenters join me on stage. Pretty please and thank you. Good evening and welcome. We are happy to have you here. My name is Rebecca Harper, and I'm the Executive Director for Lake County Farm Bureau. I have a few housekeeping matters before we get started. I would first like to thank our partners, Robinson Rancheria and Lake County Water Resources, our hosts here at the Soparis, and Sam Houston, who is streaming and recording the event for us. Thanks to all of you. I would also like to thank the following individuals for joining us as presenters tonight. Ben Ewing, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Luis Santana, Robinson Rancheria, Fred Freyer, USGS, and Jessica Bean, State Water Resource Control Board. So I'd also like to extend some gratitude to our volunteers, Susan LeGrand and Daryl Sinram, who are working the front table, as well as Aaron Evans and Summer Brown, who will be on the floor to collect your questions. Really quickly, I'd like to direct your attention to Summer and Aaron, who are over here on the left side in the back of the room. Awesome. So each presenter will have 15 to 20 minutes to present and 5 to 10 minutes for questions. We will be on a strict timeline. Questions will be written on the provided note cards and will be collected by a monitor. Questions will then be recited by a moderator, either EJ or I. Questions will be screened for duplicity and other factors. Unfortunately, one of our presenters, Jared Sellers with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, is unable to join us today. He has COVID, sad times. But although that's unfortunate, we will have a little bit more flexibility for presentations and questions tonight. So this event is being live streamed on the Lake County Farm Bureau Facebook page and the Lake County Water Resources YouTube channel. A recording will be available following this event. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome Ben Ewing, Fisheries Biologist, to present on behalf of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Thanks. Okay, change of plans while we're getting Ben's presentation up. We're going to switch things around, and Luis Santana of Robinson Rancheria is going to provide a quick overview on what Robinson Rancheria has been doing with regard to the Hitch emergency.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Luis Santana. I work for Robinson Rancheria. I'm a fisheries biologist. And so as far as Hitch, we've been doing a ton of different things. We have been doing some kind of monitoring, mostly seining, so smaller nets around 40 feet. And that's beach seining, electrofishing. But the one thing we do that's, involves the community a lot is fish rescues. And so last year was the first time that I kind of ever got involved with adult rescues because of flooding. So if a lot of you are familiar with Clark Drive in Kelseyville, I got a call from a community member, and they were saying, hey, I think there's Hitch in this ditch along Gaddy Lane. And so I went, and I'm like, no, there's nothing here. So we kept going down the road, and sure enough, there was a bunch of adults in the ditch along Clark Drive. And so we initiated fish rescue. I let the Department of Fish and Wildlife know, like, hey, there's Hitch here. We have the equipment available. Can we do this rescue? And, they said, yeah, go ahead and do that. And it was really cool to see, growing up here, I'd never really seen anything like that or heard of it. But there was a bunch of just community members out on their driveways, and they'd be like, oh, there's fish over here, there's fish over here. And it was really cool to see and to take part of that. And then a couple weeks later, I got an email from CDFW again about something similar along Merritt Drive. And it was, I was like, oh, I don't know if this is right, but actually the landowners here, Jane, we went to her property, and she had a ton of Hitch in this little ditch that used to be historic Thompson Creek. And she had done a great job of getting most of those out. And so this is Merritt Road right next to the airport. And so we did that for a few days and got out as many as possible. But during rescues, you can't get them all. And typically, if water's gonna come, you want them to, do their thing naturally. Hopefully they get out by themselves. And so a lot of the time we did allow that to happen. And by the time we were done, I think the third or fourth trip there, we said, you know what? They've done a good job. We're gonna let them do their thing from here on out. And so the following couple months, Big Valley staff, fisheries staff was monitoring a bunch of locations, and they would call us every now and then in case they needed some of our equipment, and we would go. But they did a great job. They monitored a bunch of pools that were disconnected throughout the year and got out as many Hitch as possible, both juvenile and adults. But it was cool to see that it wasn't just happening in Kelseyville and Lakeport, but it was happening everywhere. And a lot of community members wanted to get involved one way or another. And so another example of community involvement, this one day we were monitoring water quality by Blue Lakes off Scotts Valley Road, and we're on this bridge, and this landowner comes over the bridge and he's like, hey, what are you guys up to? And we just start talking. I'm like, hey, you have a debris problem. You have a ton of wood right there on your bridge. Like, you're not afraid this is gonna wash out? And he's like, yeah, I am. I just haven't had the chance to get out there. I'm older. My kids don't live here. I just, haven't had the chance, and it's a lot of hard work. And I was like, hey, well, in exchange for us being able to do monitoring on water quality here, we'll clean this out. And he's like, really? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And so in November, I think, is when we finished cleaning out under the bridge. And that first initial storm in December, it was crazy the amount of debris that washed down from upstream. And so that's actually one of the reasons Clark Drive overflooded and there was a bunch of Hitch stranded, because downstream there was a bunch of blockages from debris just from years of nothing happening in those creeks. And so one of the reasons was landowners didn't really know if they were permitted to be able to go in there and remove this debris, just because like I barely know permits, and I work with them all the time. So I think this year they finally, CDFW did a good job, their CEQA team, to kind of explain the situation. As long as you use hand tools and you're not doing any earth moving, you're permitted to do so. So when we were clearing this bridge, we had chainsaws and loppers. And so it took us about a week, and there was a ton of debris under this bridge. It was crazy. And so after the first rains in December, a whole cottonwood, like giant cottonwood, floated under the bridge and like landed down below. And I was like, whoa, that's interesting. And then the second storm comes, and then the third storm. And so at this point, there's a bunch of debris piles throughout the creek. And so the last storm, we were like clearing the section of the floodplain, and we cut a big section of a cottonwood out. And so it was probably like a 6-foot clump that was attached to the root wad. So it was pretty heavy, so we didn't move it. But after this last storm, that thing was downstream. And so there's a lot of energy from the creek that was able to move that stuff. And on top of that, there was probably a 50-yard debris pile that also washed down. And so that landowner is actually losing a lot of bank to his residents. And I think in 1999, he said he had about 50 more feet of bank there. And so it's just slowly eroding. And so I told him, I'm like, hey, I know how to do river restoration. This could potentially be a good floodplain project. It's habitat enhancement for Hitch, habitat enhancement for other wildlife, but at the same time, your flood risk will go down because the water has more room to spread out. And so we've been working on a grant to try to get that, and we've got to the second stage of that grant, so hopefully we're able to get the funding soon, so he doesn't have to lose his house because Scotts Creek just keeps carving into his land. So that's one of the things we're working on. We work with other tribes in the area. We work with the Tribal Eco Restoration Alliance to be able to do burns in certain areas. So that's fuel reduction, but at the same time, like when they do tule burns, that allows for enhancement in that habitat and for the habitat to be more dynamic because the fire burns differently in certain areas. And so when the water comes up and kind of disperses throughout the habitat, there's different little like pockets of habitat that fishes could, use, not just Hitch, but everything else. So burns are really good for the landscape along the lake, but also throughout the creeks. If you start burning through the creeks, you're able to reduce the fuel load, and you're able to reduce the debris that's being washed down. That's going to be a problem for your neighbors downstream. And so that's one of the things we've been like really pushing. Like if there's debris piles, let's try to get rid of them. It is difficult. It's a lot of hard work, but it helps with both flooding, but it also helps for fish passage. And so I'm like, yeah, let's just do it. Whatever we can do to help whatever kind of members that, community members that want us to come help, let's do it. As long as we have time, we'll get to it. Obviously, our crew is tiny, so we can't be everywhere at once. But as part of building our capacity to be able to do so, hopefully we keep expanding and we're able to do a lot more. But there are a lot of partner organizations that also help out with this kind of stuff. Like I mentioned, Terra, the Tribal Eco Restoration Alliance, they also specialize in this stuff, debris removal, fuel loads management, a ton of different things, and they go throughout the state. So they have a lot more experience with different habitats in that aspect as far as fuel loads. And then kind of to move back to the fishing part, our carp and goldfish management, we're gonna start that here. Well, we started it, but we're going on to our next phase next month. And that's mostly to help out with avoiding predation with eggs that are laid in the lake. And so that starts, well, we're gonna start again in February 5th through the 9th. We'll be out there, and that's partnerships with all the other tribes in the area, whoever wants to participate with CDFW, state agencies come along. Community members are always, wanting to show up, but the thing about my work schedule, it's the same as almost everyone else's work schedule, so typically they can't come out. But what we're end up doing in February, we're going to tag carp and goldfish, and then hopefully May and June, we do carp and goldfish removal. And there is opportunity for community engagement there to try to help out with removal. But, the overall goal in my aspect, like in my mind, after our grant is done with this process, yes, we want to help with management, but I kind of want there to be a commercial fishery on the lake so people could make money off those carp and goldfish. And so hopefully that also enhances the community in one way or another. That covers most of it. I kind of wanted to leave a lot of room for questions, even if it's not just me. I mean, everyone up here comes from out of town. I'm here all the time, so you guys could ask me questions whenever you need.
Awesome. So if there are any questions for Luis at this time, if you have them written on a note card, please raise them, and we'll get those questions answered. If not, we will be moving on to our next speaker, Ben Ewing. So now's your time for questions. I'll give you 10 seconds. I see one over here. Okay. Yeah. We'll get those questions down here to EJ, and we'll get those answered for you. So we can begin dialing up Ben's presentation, and we'll move to Ben next. Awesome.
All right. So the first one I have here, Luis, it says, Clerk, Clear Lake Environmental Research made a reporting / observation, got it, app, and made a reporting / observation app. Is that the data being looked at, and if not, why? It seems like a valuable opportunity to increase the number of observations. I've heard that data is being discredited, but could be useful statistically analyzed for a higher confidence. Do you understand the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm having a hard time reading some of this handwriting.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. When it comes to the statistical analysis with all this kind of stuff, citizen science is great. The problem, not just with, I'm not talking about that data, but we don't really have a baseline data set from the past. Like the clerk data is great, but it's only recent. Whereas, salmon, steelhead, sturgeon, there's tons of numbers from like the 1960s and 70s. I am not that great of a statistician, so I don't really look at it that much when it comes to statistics. I'm kind of trying to build my own database right now, so later on we can go ahead and also use those observations. The problem with those kind of statistics, like scientific, citizen science, whatever it may be, there's always human error, but it is a great way to, look at things in the past and see, what happened here. And I have used it to, go to certain areas and be like, okay, so are the Hitch here? Is there a ton of sucker? Like, what may this be? So I do use it, but not to the full extent, just because I don't really have time to go through it all.
Okay, next question. Reminder to please write as legibly as possible. That greatly aids in our ability to read these questions. So the next question is, what can we do to help Coal Creek flow to prevent flooding?
Oh man, that is a good question. So one of the suggestions I made last year to one of the landowners, there's like this big piece of the property that kind of wasn't being used, and he told me, you know, that's a problem area, so I don't plant there. And so I was like, hey, did you ever think about doing like kind of like a levee setback project, but also lowering the floodplain so more water could disperse there? Coal Creek is crazy, to say the least. I walked it when it was dry, and I was like, this makes a lot of sense of why it was flooding, because there's a ton of sediments still in Coal Creek, and so those sediments aren't being flushed out as often as they should be. A lot of it is due to the debris piles that are holding them back. So one thing we can do is clear the debris. But another thing we could do is do some debris removal or some floodplain enhancement. And I think the county is working on that. The problem with these grants is they take forever. So that even if you have like an idea and you're like, okay, I'm gonna get this grant. Okay, you got this grant, but now you have to do engineering, now you have to do permitting. And so it's at least 3 years out once you do that. As far as Coal Creek, I work on that side of the lake. So I work in Upper Lake and Nice, and so I have a ton of stuff over there. So Coal Creek, I mean, I would definitely reach out to Big Valley to see if there's anything to do, or the county, because I know they are working on a bunch of different projects.
Explain your idea for commercial fishery, please.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, if you guys know what commercial fishery is on the ocean, the commercial fishery potential for carp and goldfish here, there used to be a commercial fishery. I think it closed in like 2006. But basically, you go out with a boat and you net carp or goldfish, whatever you're permitted to get commercially, and you go sell it to the fish market in the Bay Area. Like my in-laws, they're Asian and they love carp, but their favorite fish, they always tell me, is silver carp. And so this one day I brought them like a 6-pound goldfish, and they're like, where'd you get that silver carp? I was like, this is a goldfish. Like, no, that's a silver carp. I'm like, I literally went to school for this. This is a goldfish. And so there is a big fish market. Mostly Eastern civilizations eat carp and goldfish, but there is a market for them.
Next question is Luis. I noticed Big Valley Rancheria had a large staff of Hitch monitors. I think they saw a large run. Have they shared their observations with you or the public?
Yeah, they shared it. I don't know where exactly they shared it. Obviously, they have shared it with me. And like our stuff, we've given initial numbers, but our staff, like, we don't have enough staff to do all our jobs, because on top of the fishery stuff that we do, we also have to take care of stormwater management, recycling hazardous waste. So like, I'm so behind on my data crunching. So as far as sharing with the general public, I'm not entirely sure. I feel like they have. I'm not too sure. I'm not certain.
Last but not least, how do you protect the Hitch eggs from predators?
Oh, yeah. Hopefully nature allows for that to happen. There's different types of predations. I think is this a lake question or just egg question in general? Yeah, that's the thing about Hitch. Not just eggs are they prey for everything. They're prey for everything throughout their life. So you kind of, that's one of the reasons they lay so many eggs, because statistically, like, I don't know, what, 6 will survive, something like that? Out of like 40 to 60,000 eggs, it's something crazy. So they lay a ton of eggs because they know not a lot will make it. So protecting the eggs, I mean, you can't really do anything besides hopefully there's a lot of water and a lot of turbidity to hide those eggs until they come out as larvae. But yeah, protecting the eggs, I mean, the one thing you can do is get rid of some of the predators. And, you know, that's one of the reasons we're doing the carp and goldfish stuff. Because one of the things we did see last year was carp were following, well, this is my hypothesis, that they were following Hitch up the creeks to eat the eggs. Because we did see him in multiple creeks during the Hitch run.
So that is the last of our questions for Luis. Please thank him.
You guys can reach out outside of here if you guys have more questions. I'm always around.
Yes, and I do have contact information with Luis that can be shared at the conclusion of this event as well. So with that, we will welcome our next speaker, Ben Ewing, Fisheries Biologist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Hi, hello. Is this on? Okay. Hi, my name is Ben Ewing, Fisheries Biologist for California Fish and Wildlife, District Fisheries Biologist for Alpine, Amador, Calaveras, and Lake counties. Next slide, please. I'm here to talk a little bit about the Hitch monitoring that we've been doing over the years, as well as projects that we got going on, and also future projects that we'd like to keep going, to try to get going. 3 of the surveys that CDFW currently does is our visual surveys, in which we have 21 sites on 7 tributaries in the Big Valley Basin. We monitor these for 10 weeks straight. We've been doing it since 2014, trying to keep the consistency. We do an upstream and downstream count of Hitch on most of them are bridge crossings, but Dorn Crossing is the only one that doesn't have a bridge crossing, but we still do an upstream and downstream of that crossing. We also do a relative population estimate at 4 sites within the lake. Holiday Harbor, Canocti Casino Harbor, Clear Lake State Park, and Soda Bay. These are sampled by an electrofishing boat. These sites were picked because of the historical large numbers of Hitch that have been seen in those numbers. And we also do a general fish survey where we do 18 sites across Clear Lake. We did those same sites in 2015. They were randomly picked across the lake, and that's done to get some information on the Hitch population relative to actually the rest of the species composition within the lake. Next slide, please. These are the results from the past year's visual surveys on the Big Valley tributaries. 2023 was far and beyond, really good numbers. It went. I think a lot of that had to do with all the water. We were seeing, like Luis had mentioned earlier, we were seeing them in canals and ditches, places that I have, not even my visual survey sites, but just little ditches along the roads, and they were all over the roads and stuff. It was a big year. Next slide. Here are the numbers from my relative population estimate. We use 2 statistical methods to get, again, this is a relative estimate. Some of the numbers are, just to give you a heads up, they're can be a little bit skewed in the sense because we only got 1 recapture, so the reliability, I have to put out there we only got 1 recapture. I marked 1,000 fish, which is good just to have 1 recapture, but you can imagine if I would have got 2 or 3 recaptures with the same 1,000, it can really jack the confidence intervals up. So, but regardless, it was still a phenomenal year of what we saw both in the lake compared. You can see what happened doing the same sites, the same marking at the same time of year from 2020. In 2019, we actually did it as well, but we didn't get any recaptures, so I couldn't come up with an estimate. So, you can't get an estimate without at least 1 recapture. So, next slide. This is the results from our general fish survey that we did, and in comparison to 2015, these are the same sites. 2015 was good. Clear Lake Hitch was actually number 3 on the species composition as far as percentage, and in 2023 the numbers were lower, but relative to the rest of the species we collected in the same 18 sites, it was actually number 2 on the list. This is some of the work, some of the slides that we've been working with the ag community. Some of these people have been reaching out to us, letting us know about some potential barriers in this creek. This is a barrier at Manning Creek above Soda Bay Road. We worked with the landowner and they let us install this fish ladder. And this year it worked really well, actually. We got reports, and I was actually out there further upstream, up above Highway 29 and the Kendall Jackson property, reports of at least hundreds of them, and they hadn't seen them, talking to the ag owners up there, that they hadn't seen Hitch that far up in like decades. So this ladder seemed to work pretty good. I mean, I'm not going to say the ladder, the flows were so high that I think there was probably some getting up without using the ladder, but I definitely think the ladder helped, and it was just a good way for the community to be able to work with us. It was no cost to them. They were still able to drive across the creek bed with their tractors and stuff. Next slide. This was done this past summer with Kendall Jackson. They reached out to us about a barrier that they used to go mow their lawn right above 29, and we were able to take that out, and that's the before and after. Again, we were able to work with them and through the permitting process, and I think they were exempt because it was a fish enhancement project. So it'll be really interesting to see, if we have a good winter this year, how well it's going to work. There were Hitch reported above this structure last year, but it was the first time that I had heard of them this far up in the system, and since I've been monitoring it and talking to some landowners that live in the area, at least 25 years that they had gone this far up and even further. And when we checked it out, even actually, I think in May, we went up there and they were probably another half mile, 3/4 mile above this little bridge crossing, which was unfortunate. I don't know if they were going to have enough water, the adults, to get back out, but at least it was good to see that they were actually able to get that far up this year. Next slide. This is another project that CDFW, we teamed up with the California Conservation Corps on some removing a lot of the overgrown vegetation in the creeks. This is just one site. This was done last year. This is just one of the sites. This is on McGaw Slough. I believe this one's at Finley. And we were able to work with the landowners on clearing the vegetation, and it was so thick. You couldn't even walk through it. And it was unbelievable the amount of work that the CCCs did to help clear all this. This was just one of the sites, but they also did some sites on Adobe Creek. If you guys get a chance on Finley, upstream of Finley Road, did a really, really good job. You couldn't even see upstream. It was so thick. And the CCCs went in there on that side, McGaw Slough, and also Coal Creek. And we worked with the landowners to be able to go in there. It not only helps the Hitch, but also helps with the flood protection as well. It protects a lot of the property, and the landowners were really gave us access, and it was a really good team effort. Future projects that we're still working on. This is actually this picture was taken on Finley at Adobe Creek. We're working on assessing water diversions. Mainly, the legal water diversions that are happening, stream flow parameters, and also groundwater parameters. Like Luis mentioned earlier about the future projects, we really want to focus on the carp and goldfish as well, because in a lot of times, especially the years where there's not a lot of water in the tributaries, we believe that the Hitch really depend on being able to get some type of spawn off in the lakes. I think they definitely prefer to be in the tributaries, but during times when during our drought, there wasn't a lot of water in the tributaries. To be able to use the lake is going to be really beneficial, but unfortunately to do it in the lake they have a lot more difficult time, and I believe a lot of it has to do with a lot of the big carp and goldfish that are in the lake that, not only on the Hitch, but also other game species in the lake are vacuum cleaners. I've seen the carp actually the first time this year. They were up on I believe that was Adobe Creek, all the way up above Soda Bay Road, and there was 2 monster carp that were just swimming back and forth through a big school of hitch, just predating on their eggs. So we're hoping to get this project going, and at least we never plan on trying to remove them for good. You know, Clear Lake, you're never gonna get them all, but just to try to thin them out to be able to get the hitch back on their feet. Also, the other game species to be able to help like control the carp and goldfish population in Clear Lake. Our recommendations are, we're still planning on trying to monitor the relative abundance of hitch, so we got to keep an eye on, you know, what improvements we're doing and if it's working or not. Trying to reduce the amount of legal water diversions on the hitch. Continue to educate the public on the importance of the hitch as an indicator species for local community and ecosystems. You know, I believe the hitch is, you know, when I say the indicator species, I think if the hitch population is doing good, it's a good indicator for like how well the whole watershed, how Clear Lake itself is doing. If the hitch, I believe the hitch are doing good, that's a really good sign that the whole watershed is in a lot better shape. Continue to, continue to preserve and restore the hitch rearing habitat around Clear Lake. There's still quite a few barriers that we'd really like to remove and try to help upstream migration for the hitch in Clover Creek, Schindler Creek, Adobe, and Kelsey Creek, and continue to work with Robbins Tribe on reducing the carp and goldfish numbers. Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we'll accept questions. Please thank Ben. Put your questions in the air, and we will run around and grab them. Awesome. Yeah, and again, we really appreciate your legible handwriting. Oh, we've got a stack for Ben. Okay, so we'll try to go through these as quickly as possible. And we are doing pretty good on time, so we should have some extra time for questions. And EJ gave me the ones with poor handwriting. So you listed fish populations. How many of these are native species? Part 1. Part 2, you talk about clearing creeks. This helps prevent flooding, but how does it help the hitch? Don't we want to keep the water in the tributaries longer to help the hitch?
Yeah, for the first question, I can't think of off the top of my head, but most of the fish that are currently in Clear Lake are non-native. So that's unfortunate. I mean, there's a lot of non-native game fish in there, but and only a handful of actually native fish that are still in Clear Lake. Unfortunately, like a lot of times, when non-native fish come into a fishery, they can outcompete and push out the native fish. But thankfully, the hitch seemed to do pretty well. I mean, from the numbers that we got competing with them. But I definitely don't. I think the hardest time is with the non-native carp and goldfish. I'm not going to sit up here and say like the other non-native game fish like take out a lot of the hitch, but I do definitely believe the carp and goldfish are taking out more of the hitch, especially their eggs. A lot of people just think of like a big bass taking out a big adult hitch, but I think, you know, when those big like 25-pound carp are you know, swimming through and just vacuum cleaning, you know, thousands and thousands of hitch eggs, I think are more of a negative impact. And what was the second part of that?
Keeping water in the streams, what does that do to help the hitch? Or clearing creeks, what does that do to help the hitch? Don't we want to keep water in the tributaries longer?
Yeah, so clearing the tributaries is a good thing. A lot of times what happens too is like there's flooding. You know, there's a lot of debris and stuff, and what'll cause flooding. Keeping the water in the creeks. Last year, especially Coal Creek, it overtopped the levees, and the levees are pretty small in Coal Creek. And then the hitch, unfortunately, get out there, and then with the waters receding, they can't get back into the creek. So hopefully clearing the channels will hopefully keep a lot of the water in the tributaries, and hopefully the hitch will stay in the tributaries without getting out into the ag fields. We've had problems in the Coal Creek, mainly because that has the really shallow levees compared to some of the other tributaries. But many of our rescues are in that Coal Creek, especially after wet winters, and those ag fields. We've had to be out there multiple years. This year, you know, Robinson was out there doing a lot with Big Valley, but in the past, I've been out there with staff and tribal members. I think it's the Green Acres area, right below Mount Canocti, where there was thousands that got out there. So trying to keep as much water in so they don't get out and then get isolated out there once the waters recede.
Next question, Ben, is if hitch are in creeks based on fixed rates and temperature, right, flood rates and temperature, sorry, which varies years to year, how can numbers be compared year to year based on observation?
Well, that's a good question, because every year is a little bit different. That's why, to the best that I can do, I try to start at the same time. I usually start my visual surveys the second week of March, and I go through the second week of May. And I'm out there every week during that time. It's usually about 10 weeks. And that can, you know, every season's a little bit different. So I've been out there during dry years, during wet years, and it is tough. I mean, sometimes I'm out there looking and the water's very turbid. All you can do is just try to be as consistent as possible. It's not a controlled area. It's Mother Nature. It's not, you know, a controlled lab where I can control. If the water is raging and it's turbid, then there could be hitch in there, and I don't see them. I mean, that's just part of the game. Sometimes it's low, and the hitch aren't even in there, and so you'll never see them. So all I can do is just try to be as consistent as possible, keep the, you know, and that includes dry years, wet years. I'm out there every week, and you know, I can only report what I see. But the main thing is just trying to keep as consistent as possible. And I think I've done that since 2014, and it's really mainly been me too. So a lot of times there's always can be a little bit of variability, just if there's someone else that's doing the counts. I mean, usually we always have CDFW staff, but a lot of the high turnover and stuff, and being able to identify hitch compared to if they were blackfish or suckers. So I try to do it myself just so I know the consistency's there.
Okay, I've got an easy one, or a brief one rather. When was that picture of the dead fish in Adobe Creek taken?
I think that was, I'd have to look. I think it was in 2015 or so. And a background on that picture was, that was on Adobe Creek, and the week before that was at a time when I was setting what are called fyke traps to collect hitch that are migrating upstream. Like 5 days before, I couldn't even, it was raging so hard in that creek, I couldn't even set my fyke traps in the creek. And it was probably, you know, I can set those in some pretty high flows, like 30, 35 CFS. And I think it was probably, just off the top of my head, it was probably around 50, 60. So I didn't, and that was literally 5 days later that, you know, because there was a lot of hitch. I could see them in the creek at that time, but I couldn't set my traps in. So what happened was, unfortunately, the waters receded so quickly, the hitch didn't have a chance to get back out.
Next question. It seems like a lot of current data, for example, big sightings by a Big Valley Rancheria member, aren't counted. Will they be considered by the state agencies who are making regulations, or will they be ignored?
Oh, they are included. I mean, all this data that the tribes, USGS, everything's, you know, the county, it's all included. You know, we work together on a conservation strategy team. We also have a task force team, and all the numbers are gathered together, and we share things, and we collaborate, and we try to make decisions based on what everybody's seen.
Okay, next question is, largemouth bass in the 2015 fish population numbers were 49%, hitch 7%, goldfish 3%. Do the largemouth bass eat the hitch? If they do eat the hitch, would it be good to reduce bass numbers?
Largemouth bass do, yes, they do eat them. Trying to reduce the numbers, I think, is going to be, well, are you for fish and wild? Well, the bottom line is like a lot of the people that you can actually harvest largemouth. People want to go out there and harvest largemouth. It is a game fish. If they want to go out there, you can take up to 12 inches. But I don't, as far as the department, you know, that's going to be a little bit hotter topic, just because trying to get a game fish that brings so much economic revenue to you know, Lake County, as well as all the tourism, and also you're never going to get all the largemouth bass out of Clear Lake. And I don't think they, even though they do eat hitch, I do not believe that they make the impact. We did a stomach content analysis, and I'm not going to say everything that we found in the stomach content analysis is true, but we did still do a yearly survey where we gathered the stomach contents out of largemouth bass, and actually a lot of them were the largemouth bass were actually eating more of like the silver sides, which are a non-native bait fish in Clear Lake, as well as actually eating a lot of their own. We didn't actually find any identifiable hitch in their stomachs, but not to say I definitely know they eat them, but I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of those largemouth bass are opportunistic and they eat a lot of the other non-native fish that are in the lake.
All right. Is there scientific evidence being used when making decisions that limit or restrict pile driving and setting dock anchors, and their effects on the hitch population during lake construction, and if so, what?
Yes, we do have some, we work with the county on any lake and stream bed agreements, the pile drivings, that, you know, anyone working on their property on the lake. We have certain work windows that we require them to work in to help mitigate any disturbance to any possible hitch that are rearing in the shorelines. The work window that we have going within the lake is October 15th through December 31st, and at that time it gives people an opportunity to work within that window without having to file for like a take permit if you're pile driving. But we don't limit it to just that a lot of times, because I try to work with the landowners. If they're willing, I will go out and do a survey if they want to do some work and do some pile driving outside that work window. I'm willing to work with them, and we've got a system working with Lake County where I will go out and do a survey on their property free of charge. And if we do not find any hitch in their property, the shoreline where they plan on doing it, we work with them, and working with them on the exact time frame when they want to do it, we will grant them, we will allow them to do their work. But there are certain constraints to that, but it's not like if they want to work outside the window that we shut it down. We try to work with them. So that's why I'm willing. I think once a month we have people can sign up with the county, and then I come up all at once and do multiple properties when I'm up here with the electrofishing boat. So we'll go out and shock, and some of the waters we found hitch, and so we had to tell them, you know, no, we saw hitch, but some of them we were able to, we didn't find any hitch, so we did give them access to do their work outside the window.
Okay, we have quite a few more questions and very little time. So, visual surveys, are those numbers taking into account the number of data collectors? Is any one organization working to cultivate the commercial fishery idea?
It's just me it's been just me doing the visual surveys. And again, it's all relative. I'm just trying to it's something to be able to compare to year in and year out and keeping the consistency going. I've had people saying, well, you're not checking all the tributaries. You know, it's just, we only have a limited amount of staff, and I only do really the Big Valley Basin. But again, it's just one of the small methods that we use to be able to add to the big piece of pie of data. And what was the second part on that one? Oh yeah, so the commercial fishing, we're working with the county and Robinson Tribe right now, and CDFW. So the three of us, and we're working with these outside commercial seiners that do it for the heavy, large-scale carp and goldfish removals in the Midwest, where they have large problems. So we're working with a company out of Minnesota, and they'll be coming out the first week of February. We'll be radio tagging a bunch of fish, a bunch of carp and goldfish, and then we're able to try to track them. It's sort of, you know, you track, what we're hoping to do is track these fish, and they'll take us to the large schools, and when the commercial seiners come out hopefully later this year, it'll take us right, and rather than spending a bunch of time on Clear Lake not knowing where they're at, hopefully we can try to track them down and hit them hard.
All right. Has the Hitch run of 2023 compared to that reported for 2022 generated discussion in between the agencies, CDFW, USFWS, UCGS, to reevaluate sampling methods used and conversation about seeming gaps in our understanding of the Hitch's life history?
Well, I think that's another piece of the pie. I think we all use different methods. So USGS uses certain methods. We use ours. They use it at certain types of years, and that's why being able to compare everything at the end and just coming together, because I don't think there's one method that's going to be able to know all, be all thing. So I do my survey. Like I said, I do 3 different types of surveys, and Fred does his gillnet surveys across the lake, and he gives them at a different time of year. And it's also I don't set gillnets for my survey. So yeah, I think it's really good to have multiple different types of methods, and the tribes have been doing some work in the tributaries as well. So being able to compare everything and get a relative estimate, but there's always going to be loopholes, I believe, in like all the different types of surveys you do. That's why we try to get we have quite a bit of different methods to be able to get a relative idea of how the population is doing, and being able to collaborate all that is very crucial. You wouldn't want to just base it all off of one method and just go. But it was really nice this year because last year we had the drought, and a lot of my survey, the spots that I had to survey with electrofishing boat, I couldn't even get to. I was still able to get some fish, but there was going to be a little discrepancy because in the first place I couldn't even shock a lot of the areas, and the USGS was able to set some spots, get in the gill net, set them a lot deeper in deeper water, and with that method, so they were able to maybe sample some different areas that I couldn't get to. So just different methods can have their strengths and weaknesses. The electrofishing boat can only shock to about 10 feet of depth of water. I can't reach the areas that the USGS is reaching, but also I'm also able to get probably some smaller sample sizes using the electrofishing boat. And also I was doing it in an earlier part of the year where a lot of these hitch might have been closer inshore. So there's strengths and weaknesses to each method, but being able to have multiple methods is really good because then you can collaborate at the end. And thankfully this year it really summed up because the USGS, and I'll let Fred talk about his, is they saw a lot of good numbers, and they can back up with what I saw this year too.
Regarding fish ladders, are all the fish ladders used by CDFW scaled for Hitch's strength and length, or are salmon ladders the default measure?
We're still working on. I mean, that's the one thing is the Hitch don't get the attention like the salmon and the steelhead. And right now we're working. Actually, that's one of the things we're working on is stream flow parameters of what minimum flows and what Hitch need, and working with the public as far as it's not even trying to turn it into rocket science. Just trying to say, are we seeing Hitch above certain barriers? Like the one on Kendall Jackson that we used. At times, I think it was mainly a barrier, but with this wet water year that we had, it was the first time I think in, like they said, like 30 years or so that they had seen them that far up above their property. So we're still working on that. We've got some engineers that we're currently working on. We're trying to get some minimum flow requirements. But the Hitch aren't big jumpers. The bottom line is the Hitch, they're very strong swimmers, but they're not very good jumpers. So trying to work with people, if the public has let us know, hey, we think there might be a barrier here or there, and we try to make it as easy for the Hitch as possible.
How do you protect the landowner from liability when you invite random community members?
That's I'd have to defer that to like a higher classification. I think from the most part, I think, you know, all I can speak of is the times that we've gone out. It hasn't really been an issue. We've talked to the landowner, explained to them. They've applied for a lake and stream bed agreement, and we've gone out there. We've ran, like, for example, the Kendall Jackson property. We told them that there was going to be tribal members out there, staff members. We don't have just the general public out there, so we cleared it with their property, you know, whoever they had to talk to, and we let them know, you know, they worked under a lake and stream bed agreement that they had with California Fish and Wildlife, and whenever we went out there, we told them what time we were out there, who was going to be out there, so, because a lot of times we had multiple tribes out there with us, and we've never had a problem. But, you know, we're very respectful when we go out on the property. You know, if they tell us, you know, just stay at this property, don't go over here, over there, and it's been a win-win so far, and I think we're getting, especially more and more momentum. I think the word's spreading that, you know, especially getting the CCC's crews up and down the creeks to be able to do a lot of vegetation removal, getting, you know, permission, and it's been a win-win.
Thanks, Ben. And this will be our last question. We can get the USGS presentation pulled up. This is a lengthy one, and it does have a portion of the question regarding bass, which was already asked. So, seems like monitoring sites in use since 2014 didn't hit areas where Hitch are in big numbers this year. Will regulations be made as a result of only one recapture? Why use parameter at all? May need to change some of the procedures. Second week of March is way too late for observing Hitch if you want accurate counts.
Yeah, I mean, I've had people say, you know, you could start earlier or end later. I started in March, and I'm not saying, I mean, depending on the winters, sometimes going early, because a lot of times you have to wait. There's not only you have to wait for the rain, but also just the current water temperature that they're going to like. So it's not all about flows sometimes. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say that there's no holes in my visual surveys. You know, I can't survey every water in the Clear Lake watershed, but I think with the 21 sites in Big Valley, at least for the Big Valley, we're just trying to have something to be able to compare to for consistency. I've had people, especially this year, say that they saw thousands in different stretches, even the same creeks that I was surveying, but just different stretches. And you know, and to be honest too, sometimes, you know, I'm out here, they might be there the day before, and then when I go out, they might not be there. It's just, you know, you miss the school. It's just part of the game. You know, if I had more time and staff, we would try to cover more ground and be able to monitor them a lot longer, you know, daily. But also, you know, the tribes do a lot of work as well. They're also monitoring out there. So again, being able to have the tribes do their monitoring, and then with the consistency that I've done on my same 21 sites for, you know, almost 10 years, that I feel pretty comfortable. It gives us a good idea. But again, I can't speak for the rest of the watershed. I don't do the monitoring. The visual surveys, especially like the Oaks arm or the lower arm with Siegler and Schindler and stuff. So, but I feel comfortable with the consistency that we're doing, and it gives us a good idea of what's happening.
Okay, that is it for Ben. Please thank him. Our next presenter is Fred Freyer with the United States Geological Survey.
Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here. It's nice to see you all. I want to thank the Farm Bureau for hosting this event, and Rebecca for the invitation as well. While we're waiting for the slides, so I'm Fred Freyer. I am with the U.S. Geological Survey based out of the California Water Science Center in Sacramento. And a lot of you are probably scratching your heads right now wondering, Geological Survey, what does a geologist know anything about fish? Well, I'm not a geologist, I'm a fish biologist. The USGS actually has a very large biological element to it. And we got involved with the Clear Lake Hitch back in 2017 at the request of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so within the Department of Interior, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Geological Survey are sister agencies, and the USGS is kind of the research arm of the Department of Interior. So that's how we got connected there. What I'm going to share with you this evening is I'm going to step back a little bit from some of the presentations we've seen. I'm going to talk a little bit about the natural history of the fish, just to kind of bring us all up to the same page on what we know about the ecology of this fish, its life history, its behaviors. You guys have a gem of a fish in your backyard here. This fish is really amazing. It's fascinating with the types of habitats it uses and the behaviors it exhibits. I like to think of this fish as an inland salmon. Some of you might think of it that way, where these fish are living in the lake, and during the springtime, as you all know, they will migrate up into the streams, and they will spawn and reproduce, and then come down and re-enter the lake. And it's really exciting, at least for me, to go out and watch these fish. And I've got, within my presentation, I've got a variety of videos and pictures I'm going to share with you as soon as we can get these slides up. We have been monitoring the population since 2017, as I mentioned, and the way we've been doing this is we monitor in the lake, a little bit different than what you just heard from Ben Ewing, Department of Fish and Wildlife. We monitor in the lake during the early part of the summer when the fish are back in the lake after they finish their spawning runs. So we are working with a closed population in a continuous manner. All right, so you can get a hold of me at that email address if you're interested, or you can find me after the presentations. I'm happy to talk some more. So next slide, please. All right, so in case you didn't know, there are hitch throughout California. There's actually 3 groups of hitch that live throughout the Central Valley of California. There are hitch in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and there are hitch throughout a lot of the waterways down south of there towards Monterey. We're obviously here talking about this particular group of fish here in red, the Clear Lake hitch. The Clear Lake hitch is genetically distinguishable from these other groups of hitch. If you want to learn more about that, this is the information where you can go and learn about that a little bit. Next slide, please. So, as we all know, this is a really historically important species for Native people in the area. They used to catch them in a variety of ways. Folks would go out and they would catch these fish. They would be able to catch enough fish to support them for a full year or more. And so one of the things that we're actually really proud of with our program is that we've incorporated and worked really closely with the tribes, especially Robinson Rancheria, with the surveys and the research and monitoring that we're doing. So that's a big point of pride and emphasis for us moving forward, because that's a really key component to be able to work closely with the folks that have this really strong historical connection to this species. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit of background. Some of this might be, you guys might know a lot of this information, but this is a fish that is listed by the state of California as a threatened species. It is under consideration to be listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and again, that's how we got involved here, as the Fish and Wildlife Service requested us to generate some of the information that they were going to need to inform their listing decision and critical habitat designation. It is a minnow. When you think of minnow, most people think of really small fish in your aquarium. This is a minnow that grows relatively large, 15, 16 plus inches in length, and it lives a fairly long lifespan. So this fish will live 5, 6, 7 plus years of age, and that's really important with respect to some of the population information I'm going to show you in a little bit. And as I was alluding to earlier, and as you all know, this fish is really fascinating with the diversity of habitats that it utilizes, not only in the lake, but throughout the entire watershed. So next slide, please. So when these fish are spawning, they're spawning either upstream in these tributary streams or in some of the nearshore shallow lake habitats. The juveniles that are born will leave the streams and they will rear and grow typically in the kind of the near shore littoral type of habitat. And then as these fish get bigger and grow larger and grow into adulthood, that's when they kind of disperse and occupy the entire lake. So this is a fish that will live from shore to shore, from surface to bottom, and so it's a fish that utilizes the entire habitat of the lake. Next slide, please. Their spawning habitat, which a lot of you I'm sure have seen, is really interesting and fascinating. So if the person controlling the slides can just hit the advance button again, the video should play. We'll see if it is going to work. You should just hit the forward button and it should trigger here. I was going to show you some video of, well, I guess it didn't play, huh? Maybe try using your mouse over the top of the video then and manually start it. There you go. Just hit the play button down there on the bottom left of the image. Yeah. Okay, so this is video that I took in 2017 in Kelsey Creek from the bridge that's next downstream from Main Street Bridge. I forget the name, it escapes me at the moment. Looks like we're not going to get to see it. But what I was going to show you is that they exhibit this, what I call this kind of spawning, these spawning rushes, these kind of aggregations of fish where you get a large female that is then kind of hoarded or grouped together with a bunch of males who are trying to get that female to release its eggs, and they're also trying to be the ones that are fertilizing those eggs. Looks like this isn't going to work. We can move on if you're unable to click on it. I thought I heard something. No? Okay. All right. Well, let's move on. I was going to show you some really interesting behaviors where these smaller males are trying to mate with these larger females, and they're broadcast spawners. So unlike salmon, they don't build a nest or a redd. They actually broadcast their eggs throughout the habitats in which they're trying to spawn. Okay, so as I alluded to earlier, the work that we do in the lake monitoring the population, we do it in the lake and we do it in early summer. And we use these old-fashioned net methods. So we use these gill nets because they are the one tool that we have at our disposal that we can actually sample all of these habitats within the lake from shore to shore, from surface to bottom. We do our surveys typically the last 2 weeks of June. You may have seen us out on the lake. The last couple of years, we have incorporated the tribes, Robinson Rancheria. You saw Luis speak a minute ago. That's him right there, joining us out on the surveys. And let's go to the next slide. So to give you a sense of our sampling program, so this is just a map showing you every place that we've set a net in the course of our surveys, just to make the point that we sampled the entirety of the habitat within the lake for this fish, north to south, east to west. And we do a pretty effective job at capturing the entirety of the habitat in which you could potentially find these fish. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the punchline in the survey data that we've been collecting. So what I'm showing you here, obviously on the horizontal, is year. And then on the vertical axis here is our abundance information. And the way we generate the abundance information is not an actual population estimate because it's really, really difficult to do with this particular fish, as you saw with Ben's presentation. And we're sampling the whole entire lake, not a very small little tributary. So the way we do this is we take a catch per unit effort. Basically, we standardize the number of fish that we catch by the effort that we put into trying to catch them. And we do that continuously over time, and we can say something about the status and trends of this population. And so essentially this is the number of fish per net that we set in the water with a little bit more standardization to it. And so what you can see here is that in the initial years of our survey in 2017 and 2018, we were on average getting about 1.5 to 2 fish per net that we would set out into the water. And these are 95% confidence intervals here as well. starting in 2019, that's when we started to see the really strong crash of the population here. And that was when our catch rates declined to the point of, if you look at the data in 2022, our catch rate went from about 1.5 to 2 fish per net sample to it taking us over 30 fish to catch or 30 samples to catch a single fish. That's the magnitude of decline that we saw in our data there. And so 2022, in the entirety of our survey, we actually captured 6 total fish, the entire survey, the 2 weeks we were out there. Contrast that again to 2017, 2018, we got as many as 60 plus fish in a single net set. So that gives you some context for how far this population really went down. And then 2023 happens. Next slide, please. And that really had us scratching our heads, because we went from a population that we all thought was trending to 0 towards extinction to all of a sudden getting record numbers of fish. And if you guys recall, you saw the exact same pattern in Ben's data, right? Like the numbers were really low up until 2023, and then in 2023, the numbers went through the roof. So this really had us scratching our heads, like what in the world is going on here? These fish don't just magically appear out of thin air or thin water, right? Like what is going on? And we've got a working hypothesis, and that working hypothesis is, after looking closely at the data, not just the fish catch data, but a lot of the environmental data and everything else, is that in 2023, this number is a result of fish being stocked into the lake, stocked in quotes, fish being entered into the lake from upstream sources outside of Clear Lake. So if you guys remember how wet it was and the big stream flows we had in the winter of 2022 over to 2023, our hypothesis is that those big flows brought fish in from upstream sources, Tule Lake and Blue Lakes, into Clear Lake, and that's what fed the population. So it's our hypothesis. Again, I'm going to emphasize, this is a working hypothesis. We don't know this to be true just yet. We actually are working towards generating the information that we can use to test this hypothesis, to either confirm or refute it. But the idea there is that this where these fish came from. So it's not a situation where all of a sudden the wet year created a whole new cohort of fish that were produced and came about into the lake. It's that you can think of it really in the sense of the fish were probably stocked there from an upstream source. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is kind of the population or size structure of fish. And this is another indication, I'll show you in a minute, I'll explain in just a minute, that is also one of the pieces of evidence that suggests to us that of this stocking immigration hypothesis. So what I'm showing you here on the horizontal is the length of the fish. In this case, it's just in millimeters. And then on the vertical axis is the count of fish that we observed at that size for each year of our survey, from 2017 down to 2023. And so if you start by taking a look at 2017 and you look at the population structure here, and this vertical line represents the approximate delineation between fish being immature and reproductively mature, so essentially juveniles versus adults. You see there's a lot of juvenile fish in the population and fewer adults. And then starting in 2018, basically no juvenile fish in the population. Moved to 2019, even fewer. 2021, we didn't catch a single one. And again, in 2022, very few. And you can see how that's kind of translating and manifesting into lower and lower and lower adult population sizes as well, right? So this is another piece of information that had us all extremely concerned in 2022, 21, about the status of the population. The fact that there are no, or at least there were no, to our knowledge, juvenile fish in any meaningful numbers being recruited into the population. And so I mentioned earlier the fact that this fish lives 5 to 6, 7 years of age being an important factor. Well, this is where it's important. And so to give you a little bit of context about what this means is, start in 2017, if you don't have any juvenile recruitment into the population for 4, 5, 6 years, that's not a good thing. If you put this into a human context, you can kind of think of it as there not being any, the way I explain it to folks is that you could think of it as there not being any babies born into the human population for 50, 60 years. Not a good thing, right? So like everybody, we were all really concerned. And then 2023 happens and it looks completely different, right? Not only does it look completely different, but if you look closely enough, you spend enough time looking at this information, these distributions are also very different than anything we've ever seen previously. So that's another bit of information that suggests that something unusual is going on here. And there just simply were not enough fish in the population to have produced this here. So that's our hypothesis on what happened in 2023. I know a lot of you have heard about the big numbers in 2023, and that's our working hypothesis. So what I'm going to leave you with here is while we are, if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, although this might not work, right? I was going to show you a video of Clear Lake Hitch holding in Kelsey Creek. Yeah, hit the button, maybe take it out of presentation mode or something. I actually really like this video because it shows Clear Lake Hitch kind of hanging out in a stream just like you would expect to see a trout or a salmon, swimming around, eating drift. You know, if you're a fly fisherman, I haven't done it, but I would actually, if Ben's not looking, one of these days I might actually go out and try to fly fish for him. I bet it'd be a lot of fun. Unfortunately, the video is not playing, so I do have my laptop. If anybody's interested in seeing these videos, I'd be happy to show them to you after the presentation. So that's what I have for you. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks again.
Okay, and the slides will also be available, so if there is interest in seeing those videos, I'm happy to send the slides out. I would like to remind you, Summer and Aaron, who could raise their hands really quickly, they have extra note cards. So if you found yourself asking more questions than you anticipated, don't fret, we've got you covered. So we'll begin with some questions for Fred, and then we will move on to our final presenter, Jessica Bean from the State Water Resource Control Board. If you do need extra note cards, would you just put your hand in the air, and we'll get them over to you. Awesome, thank you.
I'll be staying afterwards, so if we don't get to all your questions, I'm happy to talk with you. That's a lot.
Okay, awesome. And I see somebody ran out of a note card but got creative, so props to you. Then in 2023, the numbers went through the roof. You observed the population numbers reported here in spring/summer. Why are we only seeing this info disseminated in December/January?
So if I'm interpreting that question correctly, it sounds like if you saw this last summer, why, if we, the scientific community on the stage here saw this in June of last year, why are all of you, most of you, hearing about it now and not earlier? It's a good question. It's a legitimate question. I can say a few things to that effect. One is that all of the data that we've ever collected is available to the public, including all of you, at the links that are in the presentation. So the data are there if you want to go out and see the data for yourselves. As Ben and Luis mentioned, there is a large group of people, granted mostly not general public from my understanding though, that form a Clear Lake Hitch task force. There's also a conservation strategy team, and that group consists of, gosh, probably 30, 40 or more people, including a lot of the tribe members, and so we're constantly sharing information. It's really great that we actually have this public forum right now so that we can share this with you all. So the more events like this that we have that the Farm Bureau and others can host, the more we'll be able to have events like this and share what we're learning as we're learning it. And If you ever want to talk Clear Lake Hitch or have any questions, you have my contact information. So don't be afraid to reach out to me. I'll certainly get back to you.
All right. Will you be sampling Blue Lakes and Tule Lake for Hitch to test your theory of their migration?
Yes, the simple answer to that question is yes. We're going to be doing that. And we're also going to be doing a little bit more than just sampling to see if there are Hitch in those water bodies. Fortunately for us, these fish have little flight recorders inside of them. They're ear bones, also known as otoliths in fish. They are little structures that grow with the fish. And the really great thing about these structures is that they record the water chemistry that the fish are living in. And so what you can do is if there is enough or a sufficient amount of variability in the water chemistry where fish live, you can actually analyze, and you document that, you understand what that variability looks like. You can actually analyze these otoliths of these fish and reconstruct their life history and the habitats that they occupied. And so that's another one of the tools that we're going to be doing. So with these fish that have been in the lake this last year, we're going to be doing just that. We're going to be looking at those chemical signatures to test that hypothesis.
Wonderful. When people see thousands of Hitch in the creeks during a wet year like 2023, they tend to think, oh, there's no Hitch problem. 1, why is this a false assumption? 2, and how do the thousands of Hitch observed in 2023 compare to the historic runs from the 1850s to the 1950s?
Very good questions. So with respect to going out and seeing a bunch of Hitch in a stream or anywhere else for that matter, what it really boils down to is the fact that these fish, if you have any organism, any animal, any kind of migratory animal that will utilize migratory corridors and different habitats, if those organisms, whether it be Clear Lake Hitch or something else, or a caribou or anything, if there's a population of fish that are kind of confined to a relatively small area where they're readily observable, you can see a lot of them in a very small area and generate either a true or false assumption based upon what you visually see about what the population status is. This is actually a very common issue in marine commercial fisheries where there's a lot of fishing activity that oftentimes will take place on spawning grounds. And so a lot of times commercial fish stocks will get exploited on spawning grounds because that's where the fish are aggregating. And because you see a whole lot of fish in a very small area, you can get a false impression of what the population as a whole is really doing. And with respect to the second question about what do things look like now compared to historically in the 1800s, that's the question we'd all like to have answered, right? You know, we don't have any information, quantitative information on what those, what numbers are. We have a lot of information that is not numerical, that suggests that the fish were orders of magnitude more abundant historically than before, than now. And by all accounts, that's really what's happening. You know, we've all had, I didn't show it in this particular presentation, but I will sometimes show a slide where there was, well, we all have an uncle, a grandpa, a dad, somebody in our family, a fisherman who would say, there used to be so many fish in the river we could walk across their backs, and now there's none in the river. We can't catch them anymore. Well, there was actually a scientist who wrote almost literally just that about Clear Lake Hitch in California Fish and Game Journal, and it just further kind of affirms that, you know, from as best as we can tell, the abundance of these fish is just historically really low.
Right. Alternative explanation for 2023 population explosion. Hitch seem to be very adaptable. They don't fall within the parameters of standardized testing. Obviously, they were there in your low data years. They just weren't where data was being collected. They change run dates, run locations, etc. The scientists don't. They are hampered by their scientifically controlled methods, which don't fit reality in certain years. How did we get all of these present adults if there were no babies in prior years?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I addressed that a little bit when I was showing you the slides and talking about our hypothesis, and that we're actually going to go through and test that hypothesis. I don't know that there's much more I can really say about that. If anybody's interested in learning a little bit more about the specific survey design that we employ to generate the information that we do, more than happy to talk about it. I mentioned earlier, the methods that we employ, we sample the entirety of the habitat that these fish occupy when they're occupying that habitat. So we actually have a lot of confidence in the numbers that we've generated, and I showed you statistically where the variability in those data and where we would expect numbers to fall. And so that hypothesis, it really seems to be the most plausible explanation to why 2023 numbers increased at this point in time.
Thank you. Are there plans in the works to remove large hitch barriers in Scotts Creek, Middle Creek, and Kelsey Creek?
I would, yeah, I was working towards that. Yes, and we have people specifically who are working on those things that can answer those questions. Yeah.
All right. You called it population crash, but this year was one of the highest USGS reported. So so it would seem the assumptions are incorrect, and yet they are used to make policy decisions. The hypothesis presented is a reach. Is it also possible the sampling and methods are an incomplete view of the life history? Your range from 2017 to 2023 is a pretty small window to make judgments.
Yeah, perhaps that question was written, prior to when we've been talking about this a little bit. If there are any further questions about, it's a little unclear to me what assumptions might mean in terms of the survey and things like that. Maybe that refers to assumptions about the distribution of the fish and where they are and where you attempt to observe them in your surveys. Happy to talk to anybody who's interested in learning more about that, when we're done.
So is part of your hypothesis that there is a standing population that live upstream? I assume this is referring to the Tule Lake and Blue Lake populations.
Yeah, we're kind of talking about the same thing again. Well, I don't know about standing. The hypothesis is that indeed these fish came from upstream in those particular areas. We don't know a lot about the fish populations in Blue Lakes. We do know that there are hitch in Tule Lake. And again, that's something we're going to be working towards and we're going to be testing, and we will be able to generate the information that can answer that question.
All right, so the next one I'm going to combine because they both kind of speak to the same thing about hypothesis, so I'll just go through it. How would enough hitch come in 2023 from the very small Tule Lake and Blue Lakes to bring population if, what does that say? Clear Lake? Yeah, Clear Lake, very large lake. In your something of samples, it doesn't make sense. And whose hypothesis is that? Could it be you were just not finding them in the lake? Is Blue Lakes big enough to stock Clear Lake in 1 year?
That is the hypothesis. So we've looked at the data really closely. We've looked at all of the water quality data, and there's nothing in our surveys that suggests there's anything unique about 2023 relative to all of the other years in every aspect of what we've done except for the counts of the fish. And so, again, it's my working hypothesis, and it's something we're going to be testing.
Okay, I've got just a couple more questions left, and this is your final reminder. I've been giving EJ all of the cursive questions. So if he can't read them, Please, please write more legibly. Thank you. The next question is, do you think the USGS should spend more time figuring out where all the babies were during the dry years that result in the huge population of adults seen in 2023 and include that in your data they're collecting to justify testing? They seem to be, that's the question.
Absolutely. So one of the big black boxes we have with respect to the ecology of the fish is we have no information, quantitative information on fish younger than 1.5, 2 years old. And that's because our sampling gear, they're invisible to our sampling gear. They don't recruit, or we don't catch them in our sampling gear until they're about 1.5 and 2 years old. And so we don't have any information on how many babies are produced in stream X, Y, or Z for any given year. But that's information that's critically important that we can all really use to assess the status of the population and use in models for projecting population status into the future. So it's a big data gap, and it's going to require resources. So we've got we've been able to put enough resources towards monitoring this population so that we know its status and trends, but there's been virtually no money, funding, resources, research applied to trying to understand what the drivers of those trends are. And so that's something that we really need to do moving forward.
Okay, last question. And while I read this, can we please have Jessica's slides pulled up? Thank you. U.S. endangered species under consideration. How do endangered species get listed when there is little to no baseline data? Are old historical pictures, oral stories, tribal, and other documented manuscripts used for considerations for baseline data?
I do not work for the Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of Fish and Wildlife, so I cannot speak to the decisions that they make. We generate the information that I've shared with you that they utilize. What I can say is I'm pretty confident they use every bit of information that's available to them, including the ones that were mentioned. And I would refer your, any further questions on specifics about that to Ben and others that work on those things specifically.
Let's give a big round of applause to Fred.
All right, please.
Thank you, Fred. And now we are in the home stretch. We'll be moving on to our final presenter, Jessica Bean, with the Division of Water Rights of the State Water Resource Control Board. So she'll be our last speaker. We do have time for questions. At this time, if you need more note cards, please raise your hand and we'll get those to you. Okay, looks like we're good. Thank you all.
All right, I'll try to be efficient so that we can get to questions and get everyone home. My name is Jessica Bean. I'm the Assistant Deputy Director for the Division of Water Rights for the State Water Resources Control Board. I'm actually one of 3, but I do a lot with drought and water rights modernization, and so I've met many of you already when we've been up here doing this because I'm leading the project for the State Water Board. Next slide, please. So just to let you know who we are if you're not familiar with the State Water Resources Control Board. We have a mission to preserve, enhance, and restore the quality of California's water resources and drinking water for the protection of the environment, public health, and all beneficial uses, and to ensure proper water resource allocation and efficient use for the benefit of present and future generations. And I do not have that memorized, and I don't expect you to either. But we have a lot that we do at the State Water Board. But basically, we protect water quality, we administer water rights, we regulate drinking water, and we provide financial assistance. And what I want to circle in on with the administer water rights piece is that a lot of our authorities come over surface water rights. But we do have some overground water depending on the situation, particularly when there's a public trust resource, some sort of an environmental issue. So just want to be aware of why I might not be talking to the biology and some of the things you've heard and the needs of the fish. I'm talking about more of the hydrology of the watershed. And so we do work very closely with our partner agencies up here, but we don't necessarily do some of the work that you've already been heard about so far. Next slide, please. So just to tell you some of the more specifics that we've done, been involved with in Lake County, we issue waste discharge requirements, we handle the TMDLs, irrigated lands regulatory program, drinking water quality, tribal beneficial use designations. We're also part of the Blue Ribbon panel. And then we do cannabis enforcement, and then, of course, the Clear Lake Hitch protection, which I'll speak to a little bit more today. Next slide. So we've been doing quite a bit of work here. We came in really last year at the very end of 2022, but really did a lot of our work in 2023. I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but just to let you know, it is a board priority. We've dedicated quite a few staff and resources for 2023, and our board has recommitted those resources for 2024, and frankly into the future, because we do see the short-term needs, but also the long-term needs. So just know that we're going to be here for quite some time to work with you. Oh, can you go back? Sorry. Thank you. So we've been doing a lot of coordination and engagement. We meet pretty regularly. You heard that we have a task force and implementation team meetings, but we also work with a smaller stakeholder group of some of the different water users, community members, things like that, and then we're closely coordinating with our sister agencies. We are doing monitoring and data collection, also data analysis I should put on there as well. We have some regulatory processes in place, and then enforcement. Next slide, please. So I do want to tell you a bit about water rights enforcement. You heard Ben mentioned, having some issues with illegal water use, illegal water diversions from the creeks, and that's what we would be working on with our enforcement. So our authorities would be to regulate surface water diversions, prevent waste and unreasonable use, which can include groundwater, and then we can investigate all types of water bodies, portions of them, systems, ponds, things like that. It's pretty wide. Our goal is to encourage compliance with laws and regulations. I just want to specify that because while we're doing quite a bit of enforcement in the area, you may not see a lot of penalties coming out of that because that's not our intention. Our intention isn't to come here and fine everyone. We just really want to understand what's happening and make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing and using water legally. We have a progressive enforcement process, so we really start with outreach when we go into a situation. At that point, we'll send a notice of a violation to folks, and it's usually giving them an opportunity to come into compliance. And I'll tell you, most of our enforcement actions stop right there. They get the notice that goes out, we work with folks, and then we come into compliance. However, when that doesn't happen, we can issue an administrative civil liability complaint, which is effectively a fine. And then if we really get past that, we can go to a cease and desist order. For our Clear Lake focus, we've had a handful of different measures we're working on. We have our diversion measurement, which basically surface water diverters are supposed to be measuring and reporting their diversions at a certain scale and reporting those to us, and some people aren't doing that, and so we've been looking into that. We also have done some reservoir investigations where we've seen ponds and trying to understand where the water is coming from and if those are permitted ponds. We also have a failure to file. Surface water reporters are required to report their diversions each year. And so if they don't do that, we have to work with them on it. And then we do have complaints. There should be a comma after complaints. We get complaints, maybe someone telling us, hey, there's somebody with a pump in the river, there's somebody pumping river into a from the river into a tank and driving off with it, those types of things. We will investigate those as well. And then we also have a cannabis water rights unit specifically for enforcement that I'll speak about. Next slide. So just for anyone who is not familiar with this, and maybe many of you are, you're going to hear me talk about acre feet a lot, and that can sometimes be hard to understand. So just showing you that an acre foot is, a 1 acre area, 1 foot deep. So if you were to go on a football field effectively and stand there, your feet would be 1 foot deep. That kind of gives you an idea of what an acre foot is. Next slide. So I just want to tell you a little bit about surface water rights in the Clear Lake Watershed. We did an investigation and really found there were about 225 surface water rights. And of those, most of them are diverting less than 100 acre feet per year. That's pretty small for the rest of California in general, but they can add up if you have enough of them. One thing I want to point out that I know many of you are familiar with would be the Yolo County water rights. It's an old right. It's a pre-1914 right. And that right accounts for almost 400,000 acre feet of water. And they're primarily taking water from the lake. And our investigations at this point with the Hitch, we're really looking at the creeks, the tributaries that are going into the lake. We're not looking at folks that are taking water directly out of the lake. And so when we look at those remaining water rights, which you can see in the little red dots, effectively, is we're looking at the total combined possible diversion at 12,000 acre feet worth of water. And then, but in 2019, which is the last time we have reported data because we get it in very far behind when people actually take it, they reported it almost 18 months later to us. It was only 4,300 acre feet reported. So it could have been 12,000 taken, but what we're seeing from 2019 is what was only about 4,000 acre feet was what was actually taken in that year. Next slide. So what we've been doing is going through and doing a few different types of, I mentioned those focus areas that we've been doing of different efforts working on enforcement. And so we sent out 47 notices of violation that covered 90% of all diversions by volume. And I know this gets a little confusing after a while, but basically covered most of the diversions. And this pie chart is showing you the status of those. And so over 50% of those have closed. And that's what I said. We sent the notice of violation. People said, oh, we're going to get into compliance, and they did, so that's great. The other colors are basically saying they installed a measurement device. They were supposed to be measuring, they didn't do it, and they installed it, so that's in the process of being closed. The lighter blue here is saying they provided evidence that they actually measure, they only take less than 10 acre feet per year, so they're not required by the statute to put that device in. And then we actually had something in that kind of greenish color, which is called a revocation or abandonment or inactivation of water right, which means we actually now have less than 225 water rights because the person said, we're not using that anymore, we're gonna give it back, or it's abandoned and so no longer being used. Next slide. The reservoir investigations that I mentioned, basically we have satellite imagery that we use to identify ponds, and we issued what we called notices of potential violation, because depending on where that water was coming from, there may not have been a violation. Issued 61 of those, and 70% of those cases are closed. And basically what we found is that most people, that remainder of the 30%, are working with us on getting to compliance. So we're actually very close on that. Next slide, please. So failure to file, we sent out 18 notices. I think that, I have to look, I'm not sure, but I think it may be more than 18 notices. Sorry, it's cut off there. But out of the amount of notices that we sent out there, we did actually have 5 administrative civil liabilities, which means that we sent out our notices saying you're supposed to be filing these. It's required every year. It's been required for quite some time. And because they have chosen to not do that, we actually moved into the penalty phase. And that's what you're seeing there. And then I believe we had one, it says ACL. I believe that we also had, it's moving towards a cease and desist order, which is, again, something that's at the very, very end of things. We also had some ownership changes and things like that. And so then the majority of people just filed those reports with us. Next slide. So just mentioning, we do have a cannabis compliance unit as well, so working on the cannabis enforcement, and this is completely separate group of people that work on this. In 2023, we received 8 complaints about potential illegal water use. We also conducted 13 water right inspections on cannabis operations that were not permitted. And then we also ended up mailing out 226 letters right at the end of the year to folks that are not registered through us. Now this gets a little bit complicated because you have your county registration process for growing cannabis. There are requirements that if you're growing cannabis that you also apply and you have a permit with the state water board. So I'm not necessarily speaking about illegal cannabis in terms of the county level, but these are the operations that we have found from satellite imagery that do not have a right with us, but we see that they're growing and they're supposed to. And so all of these are underway currently. Next slide, please. And this is a slide you might want to take a look at if you're interested in later when they go out, but basically we've identified how many we sent out per creek of interest, and then it shows how many people responded versus did not respond. And so we have a team that's working really closely, again, specifically with the non-responders to find out what's happening. We have had, I believe, one administrative civil liability, so a penalty going out for a cannabis operation so far. Probably we'll see more going into 2024 because a lot of this work is going to be continuing throughout the year. Next slide. So what are we going to be doing in 2024? Really continuing the activities we're doing. Some of these are on rotation. You have to file reports every year. We're going to be following up to make sure that happens in 2024. We're going to be continuing, investigating complaints that we get of illegal diversions. We're also going to be assessing changes and impacts. So how did all the work that we put into 2023, did it change anything into 2024? Or do we have people in compliance that are moving forward, and that's great? Is there anything else we need to do in terms of education? And then the middle bullet there says information order compliance and enforcement, which I'll speak to in a minute when we talk about our regulatory actions. Next slide. So one of the things that we've been doing is looking at the existing data that's available and then doing some data monitoring and collection throughout 2023. A lot of that has to do with stream flow gauging and measurements, and then also where we do have access to groundwater information. I'll show you on our next slide the current data that we've been using. But effectively, what we have determined over the past year is there's a lot of data gaps. And I think many of you are familiar with that. It's a theme you're hearing here. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. There's a lot of things we don't know. But for the water board's work, is what we find is groundwater pumping may be impacting creek flows. We just don't know how much or the timing or where that's happening. And to do that, we're going to need additional information. We need more data. And so some of the challenges that are very specific is we don't necessarily know where the wells are located. I mentioned that we are primarily regulating surface water rights, and there's a lot of reporting required of that. But as those of you who have groundwater wells are familiar, there isn't the same requirement for those. So when there are environmental issues or public trust issues, we do have the capacity to request additional information. And so something else we're wondering about is groundwater level fluctuations. We see them happening, but as your GSA says in the groundwater sustainability plan, they seem to recover at the end of the year. So what does that mean for seasonal? And that's something that we don't know. Maybe we see it at the beginning of the season, and the end it seems to recover, but we don't necessarily know what's happening in the in-between. We don't necessarily know the groundwater surface water interaction relationship. It's unclear. And then we don't have a lot of detailed information about the subsurface. So when you're talking about the geology, there's some really good information that's out there, but the scale doesn't necessarily work for us. And so we're looking at things like aquifer pump tests to get a better idea of what's happening under the surface where we can't see. And again, when we talk about the current data sets, I won't go through this slide, but you can take a look at it just to ensure that we've spoken with many of you out there in the community who have data. We're always open to get more of the data, but the tribes in particular have been giving us data. The county has given us a lot of data, but even individual landowners also have been providing it. So we're really looking at a slew of information in terms of historical documents and research to try and figure things out before we get to the point where we were asking for additional information. This is just a quick data gap, an image to kind of show what some of the things that we're talking about here. So this is a well on Adobe Creek, and this is from the county that they gave us. And basically what we have here is a monthly reporting. They go out, they measure the level in the well, and this is the report of where that level is, and every month they go out and do that. So you can see the little stars, shows you not really much of a change is what we're seeing in that well from month to month. Next slide, please. So this is some data that we received from one of the tribal monitoring programs where they have a continuous data logger in a well. And what that does is it doesn't measure the volume of water the person's taking or what they're doing with the well. It's just measuring, helping us measure what that groundwater level is at any given time continuously. So you can see there's actually quite a bit happening in between those individual monthly dates. And so this is when what we're talking about, trying to figure out what's happening at a certain scale. I point out there when you get to May, June, and July, there's, kind of some big dips that are happening. Seems to be recovering, but there's 30 days that's happening. So what does that mean? And I don't have an answer for you for that right now, but we are looking to fill that data gap. Next slide. So some of what we're doing is we're supporting the existing tribal gauging efforts, and we're also having some of our staff go out and do those. We have continuous well monitoring devices available. So if people are interested in saying, I have a well, I'd be okay with you using one of those continuous measuring devices in there so we can get better data. I have them for free. I have people who can come out and put them in there for free. And I have lawyers who will write up those contracts to give us the ability without the liability on you to let us come out there. I heard that question earlier. So we can do all that. And then we're planning for aquifer pump tests. And this is kind of a big deal. This is in our partnership with the Department of Water Resources. They have agreed to come out and do these tests. We just need to find suitable locations and access to wells for those. So again, folks that are interested in working with us to get additional information, these are great ways that you can do that, and we can do these for free. Next slide. We're doing some analysis and model building as well. I said this is a long-term effort for us. We've hired a consultant that we have right now a $500,000 contract with. We're probably going to be almost doubling that. We have them for 3 to 4 years to really help us analyze the information, but also going out and potentially doing some of these activities. So if you said, oh, I'm really interested in participating and having somebody come out to my well and put this equipment in, but I really don't want Jessica to come out because she's with the State Water Board, I have a third-party consultant that I can send out there if that would make you feel a little bit better too. So happy to work with folks on those types of things. Next slide. So this is the end point. I'm going to wrap it up pretty quickly here, but regulatory actions are the next piece. And without getting into too much information here, there was an executive order last year that highlighted the need for additional information and work in this watershed to protect the Hitch, and it authorized the State Water Board to adopt emergency regulations. And those emergency regulations were adopted on December 6th, so we just did that. And basically, those emergency regulations allow the State Water Board to issue information orders. Just asking for information, just asking for you to report, not you, asking for people in the watershed area, I'll show that in a second, to provide information to us to report. Oh, sorry, thanks. And what I wanted to point out here is that we're anticipating the emergency regulation will go through approval on Monday. So this coming Monday is when you will see that, and shortly thereafter we anticipate issuing related orders. So I'm going to walk through some of that for you now. Next slide. So this is the watershed as we have it as defined in the regulation. It may not be the entire watershed that you're used to seeing. It's a smaller subset. But the purpose, again, is to gather information within the watershed to see how groundwater pumping and surface water divisions impact creek flows. So that's really what we're looking at. We're also interested in figuring out management actions, things that we can do to solve some of these problems as well. So I'll get into that in a minute. But again, defined here, that's a big area. You're wondering, are you going to really go after sending information or to all these people? No. Next slide, please. It's really hard to see, and I apologize, but the orange outline here is, maybe I can do this, is the same green area that you just saw. And what you can see here is these are the creeks that were outlined in the last one. These are some of the key creeks and some of the tributaries feeding into them. And there's some up here, there's a few down here, and then the green here, that is the Big Valley groundwater basin. And so essentially what we're looking at is targeting groundwater users within the groundwater basin, the Big Valley groundwater basin, and within 1,000 feet of these key creeks that are here. And I know that some of the tributaries, they're tributary to some of the creeks we've been working on. So just note that if you are roughly within these areas, there's a good chance you may see an information order. Hard to tell on that, I recognize, but you can kind of get a sense that we did put a buffer in there, and that was a request that we had when we were putting the information order, the regulation together, was, hey, can we buffer that? And I know it was pretty vague in the regulation, but for the information order, this is the area that we're targeting right now. Next slide, please. So I'm going to preface this with these are all somewhat tentative because, as I said, Monday is when we're supposed to be having our regulation approved by the Office of Administrative Law. So these are all based on that date. But we have 3.5 actions that we're asking for. So folks are going to have to confirm they received the order, and they're going to choose a reporting pathway, and I'll talk about that in a second, by the end of February. And that's just going to be going online and just saying, yes, I received the order. Yes, this is how I'm going to comply. Maybe they say, I'm a domestic user, and they have a really quick couple of questions, and we say, okay, thank you. We're not going to be asking for additional information because we're targeting larger water users. We are going to ask folks to measure their groundwater extractions from March 1st through July 31st. Now, before you get too upset, we're not requiring you meter those. If you have a meter, we're going to ask you to meter those. But if you don't have a meter, you don't have to put one on. We're going to have an estimation method that we'll offer you that you can use. And actually, there's a few different ways you can do that. So we'll be giving guidance on how to do that. And then the third one here is you're going to submit 2 reports with extraction, diversion, and water use information. The first report is going to be due on March 31st, and then you're going to be measuring your groundwater extractions. And then the second report is going to be due later in the year on August 31st. And the due dates, again, are still tentative because we are still working out a few of those things. But I do want to specify we have a lot of compliance assistance on these to help people understand. Next slide. Okay, so here's the process. The orders are going to be sent by mail and by the end of January, which is here much faster than I think any of us thought, that we're already almost through January this year. The letter will explain what is needed and when it is needed, so it'll clarify those dates in case there's any shifting. I will say none of those dates will be earlier than what I just posted. They would all get pushed out, if anything. Information will be submitted through an online platform. We're going to have staff available to assist you with that if you have any questions. I will point out there is a failure to comply option here. As I said, we do a lot of enforcement, so if somebody is required to report and chooses to not comply with that, there are penalties. Next slide. Reporting pathways. This is very important. There's going to be 2 options for reporting if you get one of these orders. The first one is you can directly report to the water board. We're going to have an online platform. It's kind of the traditional way that we're going to assume most people are going to go. However, we've also been working very, very closely with Rebecca and the Lake County Farm Bureau to offer another option for reporting through the Farm Bureau. And it's something called alternative compliance. But essentially, instead of reporting directly to the State Water Board, you'd be reporting through Rebecca, most likely through the Watershed platform that some of you are already familiar with the ILRP. Before you go, just want to point out, you have to register for that program by contacting Rebecca by the 29th. And I know this is all probably feeling very overwhelming right now. You don't have to write it down because it may not apply to you, but if it does apply to you, you're going to be getting more information about this, and we're going to have a lot of resources to help. Next slide. Types of information we're going to be asking for without getting to the specific questions. Groundwater well, location and depth. When, where, and how water is being used. Mentioned the volume and timing of diversions. That does have to do with the extraction that we mentioned. Some frost protection information, just a general sense of what's happening, irrigation and conservation practices, and storage information. And the specific questions we're going to be asking for that are going to be required in the reports, they will go out with the order and actually may be available even sooner than that if we can get those posted on our website. Next slide. How are we going to use the information? So it's going to inform our groundwater surface water study, which we are already starting to conduct. We're working with O'Connor Environmental. They're our technical assistance provider. We're going to be hoping to identify key areas where problems could occur, really looking to target areas. And then this will help us support local collaboration and voluntary actions, also will help us plan projects. As you know, you've probably heard a lot of resource issues, not a lot of funding, and so we want to be able to figure out where we can target that funding to make it most effective. Next slide. So some resources and support specifically for this, we're going to be planning, well, our website, which should be www.waterboards. There's a little error there with the C. We apologize for that. You can always get information there. We're going to post everything there, but we are going to be having a workshop in Lakeport on the 16th in person, where we can talk through these different things and explain options and have a lot more time to offer them to you. We're going to be offering some virtual office hours, some standard hours that were available where folks can call in and just talk to folks and find out more information, particularly when that reporting is coming up. We have an email subscription list, and we have the Clear Lake Hitch email here. If you have any questions, you can always send them to us. And I'll just go ahead and pause there. Thank you.
Okay, with that, we will be accepting questions for Jessica. If you have them, please put them in the air. If you need more cards, Summer and Aaron have those. We are running a bit behind, so we'll try to work through these as fast as possible. I did anticipate that this would be where most of the inquiry was, so we'll work on getting those questions answered. Again, some may be screened for duplicity. If you formulate more questions while we're asking these questions, please just put them in the air. Thanks. Okay, so can reporting deadlines be delayed for cause, i.e. if you're in the middle of harvest?
We took into consideration that harvest was going to be happening around that August deadline. And we have a small group of agricultural interests that we meet with pretty regularly, and we work through that. And we recognize that that's a challenging date. And if we had any other date that we could put in there for our to get it over for our our modeler to work through, we would push the date out further. Unfortunately, that's feeling like a pretty hard deadline at this point. There may be some potential situations on an individual basis if there was some sort of cause, but being in the middle of harvest at this point would not be considered cause for moving that deadline out. But I will say the intention of the reporting is to front load as much of the information as possible. So the bulk of information would be in the first report, in that March report. And the hope is that there would actually be very little beyond the week, and I probably didn't mention this, was the weekly volumetric measurements. It's not daily volumetric measurements that you would be, if you had the order that you'd be reporting. That would probably, I think, be the only thing that would be in the second report. Maybe a follow-up on when you started irrigating that year, or if there were any frost protection dates that weren't accounted for by March 31st, those types of things.
Yeah, and I will just emphasize really quickly that there will be lots of resources and support available through both the alternative compliance pathway and the standard reporting pathway. So just wanted to add some encouragement there.
A 2016 University of California paper estimated the economic value of angling in Lake County at approximately $1 million annually. The latest 2021 crop report on lakecounty.gov estimated county agriculture valued at $83 million, consisting of $54 million in grapes and $17 million in pears. From a local economic impact perspective, isn't it better to direct attention to removing non-native fish from Clear Lake, game fish, and other other source? I think it says the economic impact would be lower than controlling water use around frost control times, increasing crop damage, reducing ag values in the region. Oh, since the economic impact would be lower than controlled. Sorry, I said something else, but
No.
But you got the question?
Yeah, I understand. I cannot speak to everything in that. What I can say is I do want to specify there's been a lot of talk about frost protection, We don't know that frost protection has anything to do with anything at this point. We don't have enough information about frost protection, so I would hesitate to have anybody get too caught up in that frost protection is the target of what we're doing, or that anything's happening. I do also want to point out that at this point, this regulation is only asking for information. There is no action requiring folks to stop anything at this point. And if there was going to be a regulation for that, there's requirements that we do economic analyses when we do that and we look at balancing. That's actually a requirement that the Water Board does when they're going to take actions, is they balance all beneficial uses. And so I can't speak to the fishing part of it. Again, unfortunately, we are siloed a bit in our agencies, and that's not what I work on, and I don't know enough about the regulations on that to speak to that. But I can tell you that we would be looking at economic impacts if there was going to be a requirement to stop anything.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, the Water Board jumped into the Hitch emergency headfirst after hearing faulty low population estimates. Has the new data that has surfaced this past year altered your approach?
Again, we're just asking for information at this point, and so the changes in the population certainly matter because the Hitch does matter. But as you have heard, and from our scientists that are up here, there is a lot of unknowns out there, and so it's possible that there are different. Well, we know there's different variables impacting the Hitch, but we don't know why we're getting the sudden uptick. We don't know a lot about the Hitch, and so we're very interested in that, and certainly want to understand that, because an outcome is to make sure that we have a healthy population, and really looking for opportunities to support that healthy population. We're not looking to take, to say cutting water use is going to fix that. We don't know at this point what the different options are with the Hitch, so we're closely working with folks on that. But again, our approach is saying we've seen, even with when we haven't had a high water year, right? There's a very, very high water year, so we had a lot of Hitch. But we've also had multiple really, really low water years where we didn't have any Hitch because there was no water in the creeks, and we know that they do better when they have water in the creeks. And so seeing that interaction and understanding it better is just really one part of the piece of what we're doing out here, to understand and determine what the management options would be going forward.
Have you computed how much water is removed in various Big Valley frost seasons and compared it to amounts of water basins to estimate percentage use in frost season if no stream regeneration is with stream regeneration? And a note, estimated water amounts in basins are available in earlier hydrology reports.
Can you read that one more time?
The top or the note?
The way?
Yeah. So,
the first part,
okay,
the question.
So have you computed how much water is removed in various Big Valley frost seasons and compared it to the amounts of water basins to estimate the percentage used in frost season if no stream regeneration is with stream regeneration?
Okay, so I think a lot of this has to do with possibly like return flows also, with or without return flows from frost protection. We have not, because we're just starting our groundwater study, and it's not just groundwater, it's just groundwater surface water study. And so we're looking at those things right now. The only way that I could look at frost protection and calculate something like that is if I have the values and the numbers for the frost protection. So I would need to know who's frost protecting and how much water they're putting on for frost protection. It's actually kind of hard to use ET to evaluate that because of the temperature declines and things like that. So really, key to that is getting that information. So that's a data gap that we have. So we could probably run some estimates, but they would be highly inaccurate because we just don't have any of the specific information on that.
Okay, last call for questions for Jessica. If you have them, put them in the air. How do you investigate cannabis operations where the operation seems illegal or dangerous? Most agencies won't go there. Do they get a pass, or do you get consistent enforcement backup? What percentage of unpermitted grows fall into this dangerous category?
I do not know the answer to the last one. I do have a great cannabis enforcement team, though, that I'm sure would speak to folks. If you want to let me know afterwards, we can do that. It is Yes, it is dangerous, and sometimes they call us the water cops. We don't actually have any law enforcement capacity at the water boards, so they will bring in law enforcement, and then they'll say, release the scientists, and we all come in to, if we've done these. It's actually happened. It's very interesting. But we go in and we do a lot of our investigations from satellite imagery. We have some pretty good satellite imagery now. We can see pretty closely into operations. We can look at them over the season to see what's happening. We can see what information's on the ground. We have helicopter surveillance at our disposal if we want to for water rights cannabis work. It's all very expensive, and it's all, so we have to really work together. We have to coordinate with our CDFW partners. We have to partner with county partners. I mean, there's a lot going on with cannabis. So do they get a pass? Absolutely not. Is it a very large effort that takes a lot of time and resources? It does. And so there is, like anything else that we're doing, there's a prioritization that happens. So it's something that you may see and may think nothing's happening, and then a couple of years later, something big does happen. And I hate that it takes a couple of years, but oftentimes a lot of these things can take a long time.
All right. I want to go into that question so bad, but I'm going to go into this, sorry. Why are you only looking at groundwater pumping causing water flow reduction? The excessive vegetation in water flow areas also affect the water flow.
Yes, excessive vegetation can impact surface flows depending on the type of vegetation it is. Not all of it does. It also depends on the time of year. We are not only looking at groundwater. You may feel like, if you're someone who receives an information order, that you're being targeted on just that. I will tell you, we're looking at everything. Part of our study is to evaluate the habitat, what's out in there. Are there invasive species? We're working with CDFW, who's doing their flow study. They're doing some habitat mapping to help us understand those things. So, information on vegetation is something that the information's a little bit easier for us to garner. We can do an assessment. We can find those things out. What we don't know is when people are pumping groundwater, we don't know how much they're pumping, and that becomes the issue for us. So where we can get that information is why we're asking for it.
Thank you. The next question is a two-part question. How do California water boards protect the lake or inform the public about the Sulphur Bank Superfund site? And part two, do tribes have water rights in Clear Lake? Were tribes included in pre-1914 agreement with Yolo County?
I don't have good answers for any of those, unfortunately. They're pretty specific. I believe the Sulphur Bank mine information and the water quality piece on the lake is through the Regional Water Quality Control Board. That's a Central Valley board. And so they would be providing information on that. I know there's some representation on the Blue Ribbon panel as well for that. I'm sorry, there was a lot in there.
Do tribes have water rights in Clear Lake, and were tribes included in pre-1914 agreement with Yolo County?
I would have to look into the Yolo County agreement, but I don't believe that is the case, that there are tribes involvement in there. And yes, some tribes do have water rights in the county, but I don't know the specifics of those, so I wouldn't want to speak to it.
Decades of stream flow data for Kelsey Creek was presented to Water Board, which showed no change in flow volume for the 5 mile that was monitored. Why was this data discounted?
Why was this data what?
Discounted.
I don't think any data has been discounted at this point. We have all of the information and it's being used. There's certainly different levels of data, and how the information is being collected certainly matters. I know there's some concerns over different methods, but part of what we need to do when we are comparing information is to ensure that the same methods were used to make sure that data is comparable. And that's one of the biggest issues, is that when we have a lot of different groups doing different work, if they're using different methods to do that, it is like comparing apples to oranges, or comparing apples to microphones sometimes. I mean, it can be really, really across there. So we're not discounting any information. We have the information and we're using it, and we're figuring those things out as we go.
Okay, so it looks like we have 2 more questions left for you. This one is also a 2-parter. Will well information reported be available to the public? i.e., will the public be able to find my well and information? Will my well use data be publicly available? Any way to opt out of info order?
No. No way to opt out of the info order. If you receive that, you are required to comply. However, we do have an alternative compliance option through the Farm Bureau that we don't have time to get into now. It gets very complicated, and I would want folks who are put in that situation to be able to sit down and really talk with Rebecca and me and my team on that to help understand that. The well information, the location of the well and the construction information is already supposed to be publicly available since I believe around 2015. That was something that was made available in California. A lot of the information on those wells is lost somewhere in paper format that was never converted into digital format. A lot of well drillers didn't submit the information, so it's not anything against necessarily the well owner. There's a lot of reasons why we don't have that information. But there are some people who drilled wells and they just didn't tell anybody. They're unpermitted. So the well locations and the construction information will be made available to the public through the DWR. I believe it's called the Oscar website. I don't remember what the acronym stands for. But so that will be there. The other information, it's going to depend. It's actually going to depend on which compliance method you go with, if you directly report to the board versus going through the Farm Bureau process. And I will tell you that there is a level of aggregation in some of the data through the Farm Bureau option. Basically in exchange for enhanced data. So making sure that we're getting better information, higher quality information that we might not get if we didn't go through that plan, and that's just something to explain. So there's an option there to have different types of information provided, but the information that comes directly to the board is basically, we say it's PRA-able, which means that anything that is reported directly through the board is something that the public can request access to. But we are trying to make a lot of information available so that we're all on the same page. And that is, part of the problem is everybody's got different bits of information and not everybody has it. So we'd like as much of it to be available to the public and everybody as possible so that we're all working on that same platform.
Yeah, and before we move on to the last question, I do want to emphasize, as Jessica mentioned, that alternative compliance pathway is very complicated, and it would take us an additional 2 hours to work through that sort of workshop, but those workshops pertaining to that will exist. So be on the lookout for information regarding collaborative workshops between Lake County Farm Bureau and SWRCB for more information.
Last question. For this monitoring, a precursor to requiring all wells have monitoring devices in charging for changing for well water. Charging for well water. So you got the question.
Oh, are you asking if we're going to charge, if the purpose of getting the information is to charge for well?
Yeah, so the question reads again,
Sorry.
Is this monitoring a precursor to requiring all wells have monitoring devices and will be charged for use of well water?
No, this is just to find out how much water is being used. So like I said, we're not requiring folks meter. We're not requiring folks put a device on their well. We have other methods we're asking people to that they can use to calculate if they need to. But no, we're not planning on charging people. There are no other like volumetric charges from the State Water Board's perspective. I know there are GSAs that do those types of things, but it's not something that we're looking to do with this regulation. Also want to point out, our emergency regulation is only good for a year unless it's readopted. I apologize, I should have said that. So when it goes into effect on the 22nd of January, it'll only be good until the 21st of January 2025. So unless there was a need to readopt it and the board made that decision based on the information that was collected in that year, it wouldn't be some ongoing situation. It's really this one-time, three-piece, but one-time reporting situation.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and let's give her a round of applause. And so there is another question, and this is for Fred and Ben. What is the estimated number of Hitch in Clear Lake currently?
I'll let Ben speak to his population surveys. I already did that a little bit earlier. As I mentioned, our work, we do not generate an actual population estimate, a count. We actually tried to do that. The first year that we started doing our surveys, we were going into it with the intention of doing mark recapture surveys, a lot like Ben has been trying to do in the streams, and it proved impossible. The lake is too big, there's too few fish. We could not generate the data to generate an actual population estimate, which is why we're using generating indices of abundance in our surveys.
Yeah, just a follow-up. Yeah, that's why I wanted to make it clear. It's a relative population estimate. We've done population estimates on smaller lakes in Southern California, a lot smaller, like 10 times smaller. Meeting with a statistician, he said getting a population estimate, an accurate one on a lake is the hardest thing, probably one of the hardest animals you can get a reliable estimate on it. So that's why I wanted to make it clear. It's a relative population estimate that we can use as a consistency in relation to all the other work that's being done, as far as, you know, the USGS and the tribal work and the visual surveys and the general fish surveys that we do. So again, I don't feel comfortable, you know, we don't have the feasibility on a lake this big to actually do, and, you know, when we did the population estimates down south and it actually got published, it was on a lake, you know, it's like 10 times smaller, and we had to cover the entire shoreline, and obviously we don't have the staff to be able to do the entire shoreline at Clear Lake. So it's just a relative estimate where we have seen Hitch in really good numbers and try to just keep those 4 sites and go from there.
Thank you. And I'm going to give the microphone back to Rebecca here, but I want to actually just give you my sincere gratitude for putting this together with me. This was a discussion we had about a month ago. It turned around real fast to have this discussion, and we wanted to, give her a round of applause. The thought was to have a more open discussion, so where people can actually ask these questions for the community rather than having, you know, a different form. This is more relaxing. Everybody gets to ask their questions directly to the, you know, to the folks that are doing the work. And so just thank you for coordinating this with me.
And thank you. Thank you so much. So with that, we'll move into some closing remarks and we'll get you out of here. I just have a quick and shameless plug for Farm Bureau. Lake County Farm Bureau is a nonprofit organization, and we represent about 300 farmers, ranchers, and ag-based companies that reside in Lake County. We strive to protect and promote agriculture while also advocating on issues relating to farming, ranching, and rural lifestyle. So everything that we do relies on our membership. If you're interested in becoming a Farm Bureau member, we do have membership applications in the lobby. So I'd be happy to talk more with you about what Farm Bureau is, what we do, and the impact it could have on you, right? Our membership also consists of other members. We're not just agricultural users. It's also community members, folks who live in rural areas. So Farm Bureau is a place for everyone. So again, I would like to express our thanks to the presenters, volunteers, partners, and you all attendees. I would also like to thank my co-moderator and organizer, EJ Crandall, for his support tonight and assistance in organizing this event. As he stated, it was just a brainchild that we had a little bit over a month ago, and so we got right to work on this. While EJ is a county supervisor, he joins us tonight in his role as vice chair of the Robinson Rancheria Tribal Council. So big thank you to EJ, the presenters, volunteers, partners, and attendees. Again, there will be a recording of the event as well as copies of the presentations available. We appreciate your attendance. Please drive safely. Thank you.
Yeah, that brainchild was fueled by Double D's, by the way, coffee.
Yeah.